This episode includes discussion of sexual assault and violence. Listener discretion is advised. This is Relationscapes. It's the podcast for intrepid explorers of relationships, gender, sexuality, race, and more. I'm journalist Blair Hodges in Salt Lake City, and our guide in this episode is Bible scholar Dan McClellan.
I am fascinated by the Bible. I love the Bible. I think it has a lot of wonderful, wonderful things in it. However, I think we also need to acknowledge that there are plenty of things that are not so wonderful and many things that are just straight up bad.
The Bible. It's one of the world's most influential books. It impacts believers and non-believers alike. As Christian nationalists gain more power over American politics right now, it's as important as ever to understand how the Bible is used to justify positions on abortion, gay marriage, child abuse, and more. Bible scholar Dan McClellan has become wildly famous on TikTok, unpacking what the Bible really says about these contentious issues. His new book is called The Bible Says So, What We Get Right and Wrong About Scripture's Most Controversial Issues. Dan joins us to talk about it with a little bit of commentary about comic books on the side right now. Dan McClellan, welcome to Relationscapes.
Thank you so much for having me, Blair. I appreciate it.
Now, this is an audio mostly podcast, but I see that you have on your DuckTales t-shirt today, and in your honor today, I wore my Frog and Toad
Oh, nice.
shirt. So, yes. When did the t-shirt thing start? Have you just always been a graphic tee guy?
I have, for my old job, if I didn't have to be wearing a shirt and a tie, I was just wearing t-shirts, and particularly graphic tees, associated with comic books and stuff like that. And then in January of 2023, when I left my full-time employment, I didn't have to put on a tie again, so it was just all t-shirts all the time, and so that's just become my work uniform. And it's great because I can get invited to go give a lecture at a university, and they're like, "Please wear a comic t-shirt." And I'm like, I was planning on it.
That is the best uniform, I have to say. And I love the nostalgia factor, too. Like, I think we're pretty similar in age, and so we grew up with a lot of the same pop culture touchstones. Mm-hmm. I wasn't really that into comic books, though. I don't really know why. My older brother wasn't, so I didn't really have a portal into it. How did you kind of fall into comics?
I was the oldest of 5 kids that my mom had in 5 years, so I was the trendsetter in our family growing up. Don't tell my brothers or sisters that. But there were 2 things that really catalyzed my love for comics. So one, I was big into art growing up. My maternal grandfather was a professional painter. That's how he made his living. And I evidently inherited some of that kind of natural skill. I began to draw in ways that surprised my parents very early. So they were always pushing me to explore that talent. And it was 1992, I was at the All-Star Fan Fest in Baltimore because I grew up in North Potomac, just outside of D.C.
Okay.
And my friend Sarab Mather and I were just kind of wandering around the Fan Fest, which is just a big convention floor with all kinds of vendors and stuff. And we saw all these big white boxes, and I went over and started rifling through, and they were comic books. And I pulled out X-Men #1 with the Jim Lee famous cover with Cyclops and Wolverine on it. And it was a revelation. I was like, this is all that I want art to be. And so I was immediately hooked on the art. And then that was right around the time they had the death of Superman. So at school, somebody was like, "Did you hear Superman's died?"
Yeah.
And so I had to figure out what was going on. And so I got into collecting the back issues. I got into subscribing to the 4 different Superman comics. So I got a new issue every week in my hold box at the comic book store in Longmont, Colorado that I had then moved to. So it was a couple of different things that got me into it. And I've always just loved the way comics explore all kinds of different aspects of life, of being human, using these superhuman characters. I think they're some of the most exciting ways to explore a lot of the things that keep us up at night. And so it's always just been kind of the background of my of my internal monologue, of my lexicon.
Yeah.
That and Mel Brooks and Chevy Chase movies. That's basically my lexicon.
I don't see that as too far off from being interested in the Bible. I mean, comics explore these epic stories, and they're exploring, like you said, humanity. They're also exploring moral and ethical dilemmas. Were you religious growing up as well, or was the comic books kind of serving that world-building role for you?
I think the comics kind of filled in that gap. I was born into a very religious family. However, when I was young, things kind of went sideways, and I don't recall my parents ever really talking about religion much, except for occasional one-off statements. But I wouldn't say I was raised religious. I would say I probably just kind of was a de facto agnostic growing up. And so, yeah, the comic books were a way for me to explore, the mythology of 1980s, 1990s, mostly smallish town America. So
When did you find religion then?
that was when I was around 19, 20 years old is when I started. This is when I'm starting to try to get out and live on my own, and I'm, kind of getting out into the great wide world and realizing how small and insignificant I was, and starting to have existential crises and worry about things, wondering what else is out there. And so I was exploring different philosophies, different religions, read the Bhagavad Gita, read a bunch of other texts, poked around in the Bible for a little bit and thought, this is a weird text. But it was a series of events that led me to be baptized in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the LDS Church, the Mormon Church, when I was 20 years old. And then a year later, I left to serve a 2-year proselytizing mission in Uruguay. And in that year, I decided I had a lot of catching up to do with the other folks who were going to be serving with me as missionaries. And so I decided to read the entire Bible and then all of the uniquely LDS scriptures. And then I got out there and found out, now I'm way ahead of the majority of the other kids who are,
I was going to
say,
out
there with me.
I grew up Mormon, and I went on a mission as well. And by the time I went, I'd been through 4 years of LDS seminary, which happens during high school. And it's like one class a day. It's not like an intense thing. And I still hadn't read the Bible cover to cover by then, even though our seminary covered the Bible, the Book of Mormon, kind of the LDS canon throughout those years. And it wasn't until I was a missionary. And I decided I should read this cover to cover. And I did. And I mean, I was not prepared, especially for the Hebrew Bible. I was like, I don't know what most of this is after I got out of Genesis.
Yeah, it's a slog to get through. A lot of people just, they get into the begats, and it's just like flip, 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 flip. We're gonna skip a lot of this.
The law code stuff is what was killing me. I was like, this just keeps going.
So it's a lot of it can be very repetitive.
Yeah.
That was one of the things that turned me off initially about it, was that I was like, we just read this.
Yeah, yes.
Why are we doing it again?
Yeah, and it's a little bit different maybe, but I'm not supposed to think that maybe. Like maybe I missed something.
Yeah, it's not a very intuitive read.
Yeah.
And which is why I see a lot of people today. In fact, I was contemplating this. I saw a discussion, I forget what social media site it was on, but they were talking about how new Christians, they should not be instructed to start with Genesis and then read straight through. They were like, the concern was that this actually is a liability. This creates problems for their grasping of the gospel.
Give them the greatest hits album first before you give them the deep cuts.
Yeah, you got to get the milk before the meat. And unfortunately for the folks who think that way, a lot of the Pentateuch is quite meaty.
Yeah, that's the first 5 books of the Bible.
Yeah.
So you start off your new book that we're talking about, The Bible Says So. The first line of the book is, I love the Bible. Like, you start off insisting on that. And I feel like in part that's because of questions about you that you get on social media. You're a social media influencer. You talk about the Bible there. And there's a lot of Bible believers who feel like your mission is actually to attack the Bible, right?
Yes, absolutely. I get that all day, every day, basically. You hate the Bible. You hate God. You're trying to tear down Christianity. That's the comments that I probably most consistently get. And I wanted to start off by saying, look, a lot of you are not going to believe me. But I am fascinated by the Bible. I love the Bible. I think it has a lot of wonderful, wonderful things in it. However, I think we also need to take it on its own terms and acknowledge that there are plenty of things that are not so wonderful and many things that are just straight up bad. in the Bible. And if we don't let it operate on its own terms, we're not really giving priority to the Bible as an authority. We are imposing our own terms on it and compelling the Bible to fit whatever terms we bring to it. And I see there's a role for that in a lot of religiosity, but it's just not the way I have ever approached the Bible. One of the artifacts of joining the LDS Church as a 20-year-old, reasonably well-educated person is that I did not come into the LDS Church with a lot of simplistic binary ideas about how the world worked, how I worked, how the Bible works. I came into it just bringing in the perspectives that I have always had. And so I've always kind of approached these things, these texts, as things that are products of human industry, things that are not free from error and ideology and things like that. And no one ever disabused me of that within the LDS Church. And I'm sure in no small part because the LDS Church doesn't really have a formal doctrine of inerrancy, and certainly not for the Bible.
Yeah, they don't believe the Bible's perfect. Yeah.
Right.
In fact, there's an article of faith that says they believe the Bible is the Word of God as far as it's translated correctly. So there's an acknowledgement in basic Mormon principles that says the Bible's not perfect.
Yeah, and I think the word translate there is used to mean not only render from one language to another, but also transmit. Because even Joseph Smith talks about corruption in the transmission of the biblical text and the need to try to restore plain and precious truths. And so no one ever sat me down and said, look, here's how you have to think about all of this. Most of the sitting down and instructing on things was related to other things. And so I've always just approached it as I'm going to let it operate on its own terms, even if I don't agree with it. And so that's always come natural to me. And then when I got into formal education on the Bible and graduate education and a PhD on the Bible, that was all just constantly being reaffirmed by the things I was learning, the resources I was gaining, the skills I was developing. And so I don't think that those two things are mutually exclusive, a critical engagement with the Bible on its own terms and appreciating the Bible for what it is.
Yeah, you say in the introduction of the book that you have kind of this dual relationship, and I don't know if you would separate it as a dual relationship, but you have the Bible playing a role in your own faith and in your religiosity, which isn't a part of your book and doesn't play a big part in your social media activity either. And you've also dedicated your professional life as a scholar of the Bible, which is a huge moneymaker, by the way. I recommend anybody out there, if you want to make quick money, just go get a degree in the Hebrew Bible.
Yeah. As long as you can parlay that into a successful social media
well, there's a ton
content
of people,
creation.
right? I mean, the internet is just glutted with talking heads on the Bible. No, but where does that relationship happen for you? And I imagine you get a lot of questions about it. And I know we kind of have similar backgrounds. We actually have similar connected social circles, and you and I have worked on a couple things before because of your art. So I've known you for a long time. The number one question I get when people find out that I know you, and this is from the Mormon side of things, is how can he think the stuff he does about the Bible and still be Mormon? And I imagine you get that question a lot from a lot of different sides. Or people, non-Mormons evangelical Christians might say, oh, you're just a total Mormon. And you believe this because you're Mormon. Whereas Mormons are like, how does he believe that and be Mormon?
Yeah, it's interesting to get it from all sides of the spectrum, because I'll make a video where I'm like, the New Testament does not present Jesus as the Adonai of the Hebrew Bible. And people are like, your Mormon is showing. And I'm like, guys,
have you read the Book of Mormon? It says Jehovah is Jesus, basically.
It is official Mormon doctrine that Jesus is the Jehovah of the Old Testament. And and then on Twitter, all the Desnat crowd, they're really not big fans.
Yeah, these are these sort of alt-right Mormons, a small... They're sort of white nationalist Christians who can't break through to the larger white nationalist Christian scene because they're Mormon, but they want to be them so badly.
And just refuse to acknowledge that the main white nationalists really don't like them.
It's very sad.
But I get an awful lot of that. I get a lot from the evangelical Christian side, but then an awful lot of feedback, both negative and seeking from the Latter-day Saint side. I have people who say, you can't, how can you say all these things and still be LDS? Or people who come to me and say, please tell me how I can think all of these things and still be LDS. And in addition to having set a very clear boundary very early on in my social media career where, look, my personal beliefs and faith are off limits. I don't talk about them. They're not relevant to the scholarly positions I take. And so that's out of bounds. But at the same time, as I said, I came into the church as a critical thinker in a lot of ways and have never really been disabused of that stuff. That critical thinking has kind of been a through line in my relationship with the Bible all through my membership in the LDS Church. And so I have never experienced, I don't think, the process of deconstruction that a lot of people are going through, and particularly the people who reach out to me for help. I am not a deconstruction guru, and I'm not going to be a good therapist for anybody who wants to know how they can maintain faith while also engaging critically with the Bible. My experiences are entirely unique and also my own, and I have a variety of different reasons for not wanting to do that. But I get requests all the time to be somebody's guru, and I have to turn them down, which is something I don't like doing. I feel awkward doing, but I think it's necessary for my channel.
Well, I wondered in part, like both of us have worked for the church. I worked for the church's university, Brigham Young University. You worked for the church's scripture translation department. And for me, I couldn't be as public about my political and religious beliefs where they differed from the church, especially on issues like women's ordination or LGBTQ rights. And so for the sake of my professional job and the obligations I had, and I wondered as a church employee, because you started your social media influencing career while you still worked for the church, did you have to worry about that element as well? Like, was it protective to say, I'm just looking at the scholarship here, I'm not getting into these questions of faith per se?
It was. I was able to say, hey, here are the boundaries of what I'm doing on social media, and this is part of my professional training. This is part of even to some degree what I did for the church was critically examine the linguistics and all of this, and try to guide translators in interpreting and then translating not just the Book of Mormon, but also the Bible. And so, yes, I when people would call in and complain about me, and I had to go talk with folks, it was always, here are the boundaries, and they said, look, as long as you stay within those boundaries, we're good. And because those were the boundaries that I established initially on my own for my channel, I didn't really have any trouble with that. And so, no, I've not faced any kind of ecclesiastical discipline or anything like that. And then also while I was an employee of the church, I also ran for the state legislature twice.
I remember that.
As a Democrat, which meant that there's an additional dimension in which I'm kind of operating in a kind of parachurch capacity. I'm doing things that normally members of the church are probably not totally comfortable doing. But, you know, if you're running for office, I mean, it wouldn't be really above board for a church to be like, how dare you defend the legality of abortion and things like that. And so as a biblical scholar, I think I was doing the same. Look, this is my job. This is my side hustle.
Job,
let's put it that way. But I'm a professional. I need to be able to act as a professional in doing that job, and everybody was okay with that.
Okay. And you still participate in Mormonism as far as I understand it. But it's something it's not something you tend to explore publicly as far as I've seen.
No. This is my own business, and I am fairly open about certain things. I'm a primary teacher in my ward.
That means teach youth, like kids in
primary age children. And then my wife is in the primary presidency. So we're doing fine. Cool. We don't need to, but this is my private.
What stake is it? People want to get an address. They want to write. They want to write to your leadership.
Stake president. Yeah. I don't know how much communication my stake president receives about me. Yeah. I'm sure it is non-zero. Yeah. But I don't know exactly what it is. But we have a great relationship. So so I'm not worried about that. But yeah, that's private stuff. I'm doing scholarship online, and I limit it to scholarship.
Okay, let's talk about that scholarship.
Okay.
Data over dogma. And that's also the name of your podcast where you explore the Bible. And it's kind of your slogan. You have shirts, you've got swag, data over dogma. And I wondered, can a commitment to data become its own kind of dogma? Like, how do you avoid dogmatism about data? And when we're talking about data, you're looking at the actual text, you're looking at how words are used, you're looking at scholarly consensus. How do you avoid falling into dogmatic data adherence?
I think that's a great concern. That's absolutely something that I think is real, and I think I would say that if there's one dogma that I allow on my channel that I will cop to, it's that all other things being equal, I will give the benefit of the doubt to the less powerful group. So data over dogma has always been an aspirational motto. It's something that I don't think is achievable for us mortals. And people always want to know exactly what I mean by dogma and exactly what I mean by data.
Like, what is dogma? Like, what is that?
Well, I abjure definitions just in general. Which is a part of my scholarship as well. But what I usually describe it as is I tend to think of dogmas as things that are not supported by the data, things that you assert, that you hold to, that you argue for because of your identity politics, because of the implications, because of your livelihood, because of all these other things, but they're not really defensible by the data alone. And then by data, I use that in a very broad, generic sense of any kind of information that can be used to draw conclusions about things. I don't use it in the sense of, like raw numbers or, experimental results or things like that. It's the very wide generic sense of data. And the idea is just that when it comes to research questions about the Bible, what the Bible is saying, how the Bible is being used, how people engage with the Bible, I'm always going to try to put the information ahead of whatever dogmas might be out there that incentivize certain conclusions. And, certainly my livelihood can become a dogma because, maybe if I make certain types of content, I get a lot more attention, I get a lot more money, and suddenly I need to start making videos that arrive at these conclusions in order for me to continue to have the same standard of living. That's an example of something that I think is a dogma. Or on the other end, a lot of the folks that I'm responding to are asserting ideologies that they have inherited from their tradition that are critical to their own worldview, their own self-identity, to their position and the success of the social identities that are important to them, whether they're related to their family or to their congregation or to right-wing authoritarianism or to MAGA or whatever.
Yeah.
Those are the kinds of things that I'm directly challenging, trying to at least. And I think I'm more successful in some videos than in others, but it's always an aspirational motto of mine that I try to keep in mind, that I don't want to fall into a trap of doing things for the wrong reasons. I want to always try to prioritize the data.
I also liked in the book how you underscored dogmas are not to be criticized, that you basically throw a fence up around any kind of pushback. You're not reevaluating something. You're not open to new data if it comes along. Like the conclusion almost precedes the work it takes to get to a conclusion. And it matters more than the work that it takes to get to a conclusion.
Yeah, and this is one of the reasons I get a little frustrated with some of the feedback that I get, because people will be like, oh, well, the scientific method is a dogma in and of itself. It's like, to a degree, but it is open to revision.
Right.
The same is true of like naturalistic approaches to things. I get accused of being an atheistic, naturalistic, whatever scholar. It's like, okay, show me the data. You call it
accused, I call it identified, whatever. No, just kidding.
But it's open to revision.
You want to see the data.
Yeah,
right.
And if the data suggests that there's something wrong with these approaches, we will change them.
Is there something big you've changed on that's an example, like where you've said, like, wow, I used to actually be pretty convinced about this thing, and because of the exploration of the data, I really had to reach this other conclusion?
The one that springs most readily to mind is my position on Psalm 82, which a lot of people will be like, well, that doesn't mean anything. But when I got into formal study of the Bible, and particularly when I got into graduate programs, I was really interested in early Israelite religion. I was really interested in concepts of deity, and I still am. But Deuteronomy 32, 8, and 9 is a text that a lot of scholars think preserves this early distinction between Adonai, the God of Israel, and a higher deity named Elyon. And so there's a very common theory, one that I advocate for, that Adonai and El were originally two distinct deities. And a lot of people have long appealed to Psalm 82 as evidence of this, because it talks about an Elohim that is standing before a council of gods and judging the gods. And then it seems like there's another Elohim that is called on to rise up from their seated position on a throne. And so a lot of scholars take this to be an early witness to that distinction. And so for a long time, I understood it that way as well. This was a very, very early text. It was deeply mythological, and it seemed to distinguish Elyon from Adonai. And then I was in my second graduate degree at Trinity Western University in lovely Langley, BC, in Canada. And I decided I was going to do my research paper for my Old Testament class on Psalm 82. And I went through the whole semester doing this research paper, and by the end, I could not maintain that belief that this was a very early text. I was like, the more I look into it, the more I actually am convinced it's a very late text.
Is that because of like language construction, vocabulary, that kind of stuff?
A lot of it had to do with context, but also with genre, because as I looked at it, I noticed this has resonances with two different kinds of genres. One of them is what's called the God complaint, which is a type of individual lament that we see in the Psalms.
Charging to God with something.
Right. And the other is the divine counsel motif. And I saw the two of these, and I realized that this text makes the most sense as an attempt to merge these two genres. So it's kind of a hybrid genre in response to the crisis of the Babylonian exile. And the Psalms around it, I think, are one of the things that I think makes the case, because you have this kind of repeated theme in the Psalms of Asaph, where they're complaining to God because God is allowing bad things to happen, and specifically the invasion on the part of Babylon, the destruction of the temple, the exile of the Judahites. And then Psalm 82, I ultimately published a paper in a journal called the Journal of Biblical Literature on my position on Psalm 82, my new and improved, in my opinion, position on Psalm 82, where I'm suggesting that they're taking the lament and they're actually putting it into the mouth of God, where God goes and stands before the council and expresses a God's lament to the other gods of the divine council, the patron deities of the nations. Yeah. And then condemns them to mortality to depose them from the divine council. And this is the event of the universalization of Adonai, where the psalmist calls on God in the final verse, says, "Rise up, for you will inherit all nations." And the idea being, the patron deities of the nations have now all been deposed. Their seats sit empty.
Yeah.
You take over rule of all the nations of the earth. So in the pre-exilic period, God ruled over the heavens, but on earth, every deity had their own nation over which they were sovereign. And now in the exile, they don't have access to Adonai because he's way off in the land of Israel. And so this psalm, I argue, is an attempt to universalize Adonai's rule and thereby universalizing access to Adonai, even for folks who do not live in the land of Israel. But this was, for me, this was a catastrophic shift in my thinking that really was just the result of me wrestling with this paper over the course of this semester.
What made it such a catastrophe?
Because it meant I lost a piece of evidence for my position on early Israelite religion. It's not that and I don't think that it, that case doesn't just crumble to the ground.
Sure.
But it was such a strong pillar in that argument.
You debunked a data point.
Yeah, it was a data point that then took one of the legs out from underneath a bigger position that I held, and I was worried that, oh no, is this going to cause this all to crumble?
Yeah.
But I was also proud of being able to challenge my own dogma, being able to challenge my own position and say, no, my thinking was wrong, and I'm going to actually argue strongly for this other position now. And there are a handful of examples of positions like that, but that's the most prominent one, and that's also most prominent to me because it was such a big part of one of the main positions I hold to about early Israelite religion.
And for you, that's wrapped up kind of in your professional career. For Bible-believing Christians who are just not really interested in the scholarly side of things, a shift like that could be really unsettling because of three main dogmas that you identify at the beginning of the book. The dogma of inspiration, the idea that every single word in the Bible was delivered by God. And if it's by God, then it's perfect. So that's the second dogma, which is inerrancy. It can't be wrong. And then the third one is a fancy word, univocality, which means that it speaks with one voice, that everything in the Bible, if God delivered it, agrees. It tells one story, it's one book, and it all can be tied together. And so you're going through that Psalm story and looking at like earlier views of Israel's God, and that there's this pantheon of gods and things that almost all, I think, Bible-believing Christians would say, what are you talking about? There's only one God. They would point to verses in the Bible that says God is one. There's only one. And you've done work to explore how those verses happen and what they mean.
Yeah.
But those three dogmas, I think, you have found in your conversations and in your work with most Christians, those are kind of the three big ones, right?
Yeah, I think those sit at the foundation of pretty much all of the approaches to the Bible that I find problematic and dogmatic. I very rarely run into someone who is taking a very problematic approach to the Bible who does not endorse usually all three, but at least one of those. Even folks who are like, I'm a soft inerrantist.
Yeah, there might be some errors here or there.
Yeah, they're unintentional though, and they don't affect
the main message. Yeah,
yeah, which is something that I always find funny, because usually the conversation will go like this: they say, well, none of these things you're talking about affect any central doctrine. It's like, well, my concern is that they can't possibly affect any central doctrine. If I found a text tomorrow that said God has a body and walks around in the garden and makes noise as they're crunching over the leaves and stuff, that would not affect any central doctrine. And you know how I know? Because that text's already in the Bible.
Yeah. And
it does not affect any central doctrine. Yeah. Because doctrine does not flow downstream from the Bible. Doctrine is a result of a process of negotiation. And if you don't like the text that says God lies, you just negotiate it away. If you don't like the text that commands child sacrifice, you just negotiate it away. So you cannot have a text, a single passage that compromises central doctrines, because the doctrines are not based on the text.
I think that's what makes your work most compelling, is because you're not just doing this for an intellectual exercise about what the Bible's about, but you're looking at how communities interpret the Bible and how it affects like everyday living. So your goal is twofold. Number one, you want to defang some proof text. You want to look at verses in the Bible that are used to harm marginalized communities or to make problematic claims or that fly in the face of contemporary ethics in some way. That's number one. So defang those proof texts. And then two, you also have to acknowledge that sometimes the Bible itself is not being misinterpreted and that it is making claims that we probably should find problematic. And so you're also criticizing some things that are in the Bible that you can't interpret away as being unethical, as being problematic. So that's really a twofold. So you can see why people who hold to the Bible as perfect and as the Word of God would have a problem with what you're doing, because the Bible itself is an instrument of power, right? It's telling us whether it's okay to be gay. It's telling us about, like, we try to make it say stuff about abortion. We try to understand what family relationships should be based on it. And so defanging those proof texts and criticizing things, that's your twofold approach.
Yeah, which drives some people bonkers, because they have a single approach and assume that I have a single approach, which is why they will always say, all you do is just reinterpret everything you don't like in a leftist lens. And it's like, no, I don't. I frequently say, this is bad, this is wrong. And so they want to reduce me to this, this single note and this monotone approach to the Bible, which is just not the case. I am happy to acknowledge where the Bible gets things right, where the Bible gets things very wrong, whether or not my position is that should be right or wrong, which is not an easy thing for the people who are used to arguing about the Bible on the internet to engage with competently, much less in good faith.
As you're looking at the text to defang the proof text or to criticize the bad ethics, you still have that love for the Bible. The question to me becomes, why not scrap it then? If there are these problematic things, if the Bible's being used in these harmful ways, and how influential is it? Is interest in the Bible declining? This kind of thing. How do you address those questions of why still wrestle with it instead of saying, there's some good stuff in there, but there's also some bad stuff in there. Why don't we just find good stuff anywhere. Why the Bible,
Yeah, and I think you can find good stuff in many other places, and a lot of people, even the people who assert the priority, the authority, the fundamental goodness of the Bible, a lot of times they'll talk about it in ways that reflect the mediation of those ideas through other cultural channels. So, for instance, and this may not be this is an example that's going to blow anybody's hair back, but somebody...
I don't have hair, Dan. My beard hair.
But, I don't know when this episode is going to be released, but it's the beginning of June right now, and the anti-Pride Month rhetoric is all over social media, and somebody posted something that where they're saying, remember, pride goeth before the fall.
Yeah.
It's like, that's not in the Bible. The Bible says pride before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall. So you're not actually quoting the Bible. You're just quoting like just sociocultural discourse. And there are a lot of ways, and, I get a lot of people who say, in Exodus, when the Pharaoh gave Moses his ring and did this, and it's like, that's the Prince of Egypt.
Yeah.
That's not the Bible.
There's a ton of those. The spare the rod, spoil the child. We'll talk about that in a bit.
But the Bible's not going anywhere.
Yeah.
And as much as a lot of people want it to, I get those comments all the time. Don't care. We need to get rid of it. Why are you even talking about it? And as nice as it would be for the Bible to no longer be a lever that is constantly being pulled in public discourse, and particularly as in relationship to political power, that's not going to happen anytime soon. And so as someone who has a degree of expertise in this topic, I feel it is rather incumbent upon me to leverage whatever resources, skills, knowledge I have to try to push back against that. And I've told the story in many times in many different places, but 10 years ago, I might have been one who would have been like, cool, you guys do your thing. I'm staying out of it. I'm going to go play golf. I'm going to draw comics. I'm going to just stay out of this. But in 2016, my world changed forever. And my relationship to the public discourse changed forever. My oldest daughter, I think she was, 6 or 7 at the time, or 8, something like that. She came up to me and she said, Daddy, what sports are girls allowed to play? And that shook me because this was not a thought that ever entered my mind growing up. It could not have possibly entered my mind because I was never conscious of any kind of limits on my agency or my participation in society as a result of being a boy, because there weren't really any such limits. Not only had my child recognized these limits, she seemed to have become accommodated to them and just wanted to know where the boundaries were.
Yeah.
And I felt like such a failure because I was allowing my daughters, I have 3 girls, to grow up in a world like that. And I can still remember I was sitting in a pew in this church building just down the street from me, and I said, this all has to change. I have to get involved. I cannot allow this world to be the world that my 3 daughters grow up in. And that resulted in runs for public office. That resulted in me deciding I needed to step up my efforts to combat the spread of misinformation about the Bible and religion online. And so ever since then, I felt like I have to get off the sidelines. I have to be more engaged. And so while it would be easy to say, I'm going to leave that argument for other folks, I feel it is incumbent upon me to be in the fray. And I will be for as long as I am able to.
I'm glad to see it, and I have to say it's obvious that it matters because you've accumulated over 1 million followers on social media, tens of thousands of people tune into your online classes, you have the Data Over Dogma podcast, you're an award-winning public scholar of the Bible, so maybe the most obvious response to why I care about it is like, because so many people still do. Like this still matters. A lot of people care.
Yeah, which was actually honestly a surprise to me because I've been doing, I've been arguing about religion and the Bible on the internet for about 20 years.
We were on message boards together.
Yeah, message boards, the blogs.
I remember seeing McClellan. I knew you. Yeah, I knew him way back when.
And And it didn't get a lot of attention. There was not a lot of exposure. You know, when you're on one of those old silly message boards, you know, you might only be seen by a dozen people or so.
Yeah, and it's the same people.
And it's the same people, right. And so, you know, on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram, the reach of what I was doing was limited, even though I collaborated with other scholars, and we worked on trying to combat misinformation when people came out with phony artifacts and things like that. The Jordan-led codices almost 15 years ago, all that kind of stuff. And it just didn't get a lot of attention. And then for whatever reason, during the the pandemic, that's what it's called. There was, I got on TikTok because I was seeing people talking about the Bible and religion on TikTok, and I was like, who's in charge over there? And it turned out there was not really anyone in charge in terms of like credentialed experts. And I was like, well, time to get into the game on another platform. But for whatever reason, there was a lot more exposure on TikTok. And I think that allowed the kinds of work that I and many other scholars do reach an audience that is interested in it and for whom it is important. And so it's kind of exploded since then in a way that it never could have on Facebook or on Mormon Dialogue and Discussion.
Mormon Dialogue and Discussion. That was it. That was the message board. How hard is it to juggle all the comments and on the back end of stuff, when you have that big of a social media presence, how much time is spent like reading comments or looking through that stuff?
I could spend 24 hours a day doing it and not cover everything. And so I made the decision, I'm going to make my stuff. I will engage a little bit, but I have to cut it off. I have to clock out. Otherwise, it takes over my entire personal life. Yeah. And my wife will smother me in my sleep if I let that happen. And so I have to be very strict about that. So while I probably read maybe 10% of the comments that get posted across the various platforms, I respond to even fewer of them. I will try to engage to some degree for a little bit of time. But when it comes to the very negative stuff and the combative stuff, occasionally I'll engage, but for the most part, because my world's not going to change one way or another if I engage or do not engage, apart from it's going to negatively affect my time and probably my mental health if I'm just constantly engaging with people who hate me. So,
exactly. And there can also be a weird egotism about it too, like an obsessive, you're going to say something about me, I'm not going to let that slide. So there could be many reasons why somebody couldn't walk away from it.
And every now and then I'll see comments about, and you know, the lingo these days is bizarre, but they'll say to somebody else, Dan cooked you. Or they love to see the dunks and dunking on people and all that kind of stuff. And there's absolutely an ego thing involved there where I'm like, and you might get the sense that you are actually some kind of powerhouse. Yeah. And whenever I get my kit to feeling like that, I'm like, need time to log off, time to clock out.
Or like see if how impressed your kids are.
Nothing impresses my kids these days.
Exactly. So it's always humbling to go back there. One other question about the social media stuff. Yeah. Your videos are the first ones I remember seeing, like when you're doing stitches. So you're taking someone else's video and you're commenting on it. Mm-hmm. Yours were the first ones that I saw the message like, don't harass this creator, like don't go bug this creator. Did you borrow that from internet culture, or where did that come from?
I don't remember borrowing it from internet culture. I first started doing that because I would occasionally get negative feedback. People would be like, "Oh, you have an audience that goes and harasses people," and I was like, "I don't want to have that kind of audience." Or people would get reported. There were a couple of instances of accounts being taken down or deleted or stuff like that, either because of being reported a bunch by folks who are coming from my video, or because of being harassed a bunch by folks coming from my video, and that made me feel awful. And so. I recall starting to just put a little warning or, caveat on there, and it evolved over time, and it stayed pretty consistent for the last year or two. But it's not impossible that I saw it somewhere else and was like, that's a good idea, I'm going to do that. I don't recall that happening, though. I just recall being like, okay, I think I may have initially just started saying it when in my videos. But at some point, I decided to just put it on the screen and let that count for that. And now I see other folks doing it.
Yeah.
So, some of them, I have no doubt they've come up with it themselves. Others, I can tell they have taken it from from my work.
You should have put a little trademark notification on there. We're talking to Dan McClellan, and we're going to talk more right now about his new book, best-selling book, The Bible Says So, What We Get Right and Wrong About Scripture's Most Controversial Issues. So the book has a lot of different chapters in it about what the Bible says about who God is, or things about Satan, or whether God has a body, or whether the Messiah would be born of a virgin. Mm-hmm. There's also chapters that pertain more directly to the kind of stuff we cover in this podcast. So I wanted to zoom in on those chapters in particular. And the first one I wanted to talk to you about is about abortion. And the religious right in America has made abortion central to their political goals. It's led to the overturning of Roe versus Wade in 2022. And they're working hard to further restrict people's reproductive freedoms. And as you pointed out, because they were coming from the religious right, they needed to build a biblical case for that. And so liberals, especially ones that care about the Bible or maybe just want to use it to debunk Christians, have also dug through the Bible. For example, you saw a viral Instagram post that claimed abortion is only mentioned once in the Bible, in Numbers chapter 5. And this is kind of where you start the analysis in this chapter. What does the Bible say about abortion?
Yeah, so that Numbers chapter 5, I still get that an awful lot. This is the sotah, the ordeal of bitter waters. This is a ritual that is prescribed should a husband become suspicious that his wife has been unfaithful, where he takes her to the temple. They have an offering. They go before a priest. He writes out a curse and then takes a jug of water, dumps some dirt from the temple floor in the jug. The woman reads the curse, scrapes the ink of the curse off into the water, and then the woman drinks the water. And the curse basically says, if I'm guilty, you have these two statements that her thigh will drop, and then her womb will do something. And then if she's innocent, it says she will conceive. And a lot of folks interpret this very rare verb that is associated with the second thing that will happen to her womb. It might mean to swell, or it might mean to sprout, which means maybe it means ejection from the womb. It will, and maybe it means miscarriage. If it does mean that, then that would seem to be an intentional miscarriage, an abortion. I'm not so convinced that that is the best reading of that passage, because the favorable outcome for the woman is that she will conceive, which suggests that she has not conceived yet.
Right.
It doesn't say her birth will be successful or anything like that. It just says she will conceive, which suggests to me that the idea here is that we just have a suspicion of infidelity. And when you look closely at this literary imagery that's being used, it most commonly has to do with curses of infertility in the ancient world, or blessings of fertility. And so, in my opinion, when this was initially written, the idea was she will be cursed with infertility through the deformation of her reproductive system, or she will be blessed with fertility if she's innocent. The earliest Jewish texts on this have debates about whether or not it would be appropriate to subject a pregnant woman to the ordeal, and ultimately they decided it would be. So certainly, if a woman is pregnant, and if this ritual were actually efficacious, and it's not.
That's actually not going to do anything.
Yeah, it's not going to do anything, but if it were efficacious, then at most it indicates that the God of the Bible doesn't really have any concern for the personhood of a fetus, at least in this case, perhaps a fetus conceived through infidelity. Although it's also possible that it could be a fetus conceived by the husband, and then the woman is going off and doing inappropriate things with someone else, and then is subjected to the ordeal, and then an appropriately conceived fetus would be disposed with. So it kind of suggests that God doesn't seem to have a lot of concern for fetal personhood.
And this is where you zoom out to the broader biblical view to say the Bible doesn't talk about abortion in the ways that we would think of it today, because it doesn't think of personhood in the ways that we would think of it today.
Exactly. This is something that you see in a lot of the arguments against abortion today, is that, human life begins at conception, boom, end of story.
And thou shalt not kill. That's a pretty clear commandment.
Right. the problem is we don't really have murder, and the ratzach is the Hebrew verb in Exodus 20 that is usually translated, you shall not kill. It would be better translated, you shall not murder, because that verb is used to refer to unsanctioned or illegal killing.
Because the Bible elsewhere prescribes killing people.
Yes, quite emphatically. In fact, and you get in trouble when you don't kill people you've been instructed to kill.
God kills you.
Yes. And so in the Bible, you actually have, in Exodus, you have in the covenant code, a law about what happens if men who are fighting accidentally injure a pregnant woman. And there are two outcomes that are described. One outcome is that the injury causes her to miscarry. And the outcome, or the punishment, is the husband assesses a fine that must be adjudicated by judges so that it's not too exorbitant. The other outcome is if the injury actually causes permanent injury or death to the mother, in which case it is talionic justice, eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, life for a life. And so that is usually the punishment for murder, is talionic justice. When something is done to a human, you do the same thing to the perpetrator. And the fact that if the fetus is destroyed, there's a fine, whereas if the woman is hurt or destroyed, then talionic justice is activated, pretty clearly indicates that they did not think of the fetus as a full moral and legal person. And so what I argue is that the real question is not human life, the real question is personhood. And we actually can see this being debated in the ancient world. In the Hebrew Bible, personhood is not achieved until birth. And this is what the early
breath
Jewish...
of life.
Right. Breath is the fundamental, essential element of life. And this is how most streams of tradition within Judaism approach this question. Now, when you get into Greco-Roman period Judaism and into Christianity, you have the influence of Greek philosophy, where they are contemplating when the soul enters the body, the process of the event, actually, of ensoulment. And you have different positions on this. The Pythagoreans and the Epicureans said, it happens at conception. The Aristotelians said, it happens when the fetus is fully formed, and then you have the quickening, when the mother can begin to feel the fetus moving on its own within her womb. And then the Stoics said, no, it happens at birth when the baby comes in contact with the outside air. And within early Christianity, you have different positions on this, and until you get to Augustine, around the end of the 4th, beginning of the 5th century CE, who says, it's the Aristotelian view, it is the quickening, abortion becomes murder only at the quickening. Prior to that, we don't like it, it's still wrong, not murder because there's no soul, therefore there is no person. And
also, by the way, there was a ton of miscarriages happening, and like their rudimentary understanding of what pregnancy and childbearing even was very rudimentary. So it was like the quickening made sense as a cutoff point, perhaps in part because so many pregnancies are lost before then anyway. So it is prophylactic. It is defensive in some ways, because if you don't think of the fetus in the early portions of the pregnancy as a person, it becomes less traumatic to lose it. This is even why in the Roman world and in other societies, personhood isn't actually achieved until a few months after birth. And this is why you have things like exposure in the Greco-Roman world. They would leave infants out to die, basically.
Yeah, because they did not think of them as people, and it made it... And because, even if the child is born, the chances of surviving the first year of life are considerably low, much lower in that time period than today. So there are a bunch of reasons that the conceptualization of personhood is contextual, is socially, historically contingent. But Christianity ultimately arrives at this conclusion that, okay, the quickening is when we're going to mark the beginning of the person. And that doesn't really change. Like, you have different positions and different voices, but it remains the consensus view until the 1800s, when you begin to have the rise of better science related to human gestation and things like that. When you also have people pushing back against women's suffrage and the equality movement. And here is where you have the idea of Mary, the Immaculate Conception, Mary being sinless from birth, meaning she had to be a person, she had to have a soul. at conception, and so there's this rationale that results in this conclusion. And so it's the mid-19th century that suddenly Christianity decides, nope, we're going to push it back to conception. And then this kind of starts...
They'll point to John the Baptist leaping in the womb when
which is
Jesus in the womb.
Which is post-quickening.
Post-quickening anyway.
Yeah.
Sorry,
also,
the data.
But also an exception, not the rule. This is because the text pretty explicitly says the Spirit was responsible for this, and not everybody has that, is not, the Spirit is not the puppet master of all fetuses. So in short, it's complex. When you look in the Bible, you don't really get a single position. You get a couple different positions, particularly if you look in the Septuagint or you look in early Christianity's debates about this.
Yeah,
but
you're not getting one view.
No, you're not getting that univocal perspective. And at best, we can say, well, early Christianity said it becomes murder at the quickening. And so, like, the most restrictive position you can really find is basically the Roe v. Wade position.
Yeah.
That we see a transition towards legal and moral personhood. At some point, the rights of that fetus have to overtake the rights of the mother. And, in Roe v. Wade, they put it at I think it was 20 weeks or something like that. Like, that's about as good a compromise as you can have, I think, on this position. And it happens to be what the majority of Christians agreed with for almost 2,000 years. So,
yeah. Well, the problem is it still skirts the issue of like terminations that need to happen because straight up health issues or access to health care. There's a ton. But yes, I agree. What you're saying is like the biblical, quote unquote, one of the main biblical views would be more liberal, more progressive than what Christians are adhering to today. So I would read that chapter and say, haha, I can have this conversation with a Bible-believing Christian. See, the Bible is not so, it doesn't justify these terrible things. Well, this other chapter that you write on beating your kids does something a little bit differently, right? So does the Bible say it's okay to help our kids by beating them? And,
it enthusiastically endorses beating your kids, which is one of those things where, and I put this chapter in here because I see a lot of well-meaning attempts to argue for a different interpretation. A lot of folks
tell about the shepherd's crook one. That was really interesting.
Yeah, what you'll see frequently on social media and sometimes in the pews is people will say, it says, "He who withholds the rod hates his child," and the idea there is, so you should beat your kids, right? And then a lot of people say, well, no, the word for rod there, shevet, is actually a reference to a shepherd's crook or staff, which was not used to hit sheep, but to gently guide sheep. And so
what a beautiful image.
Yeah, and it's very well-meaning. It is a wonderful message, and it has absolutely nothing to do with what the author of Proverbs was trying to say, because you have 8 occurrences of the word shevet in the entire book of Proverbs, and the word can just generically refer to any kind of stick. Contextually, it can refer to a staff that indicates authority, like a scepter or something like that.
Yeah.
It can refer to a shepherd's staff. It can refer to a rod of discipline in the hands of parents, in the hands of God, or in the hands of a slave master. When you look at the occurrence of shevet across the book of Proverbs, every single time it is referring to a rod of discipline. And, it calls the shevet, it says a bridle for a horse's mouth or a donkey, I forget exactly what it says, and a shevet for the backs of fools.
Pretty specific.
It is very specific. And then we have a very enthusiastic, if you beat your child with a shevet, you will not kill them, you will save them from Sheol. And, it
That's
uses...
like hell.
Yeah, this is
under realm or something, right?
Death, basically. Yeah, the idea is not.
Oh yeah, because they didn't really have an afterlife type view, right?
Right. That's another chapter in the book. So I probably shouldn't have said hell. That's how it's translated in some places. But the idea is you will save them from death in the sense that they will not go off and do something stupid and be killed or die or shorten their life because of it. And it's very explicitly about beating children. The verbal root there means to strike, to hit, to smite.
Yeah, I like when you say you agree with the rhetorical goal of the person who offered that. And I've seen this in your videos quite often. It's like, hey, I like what you're doing here. This is creative. And maybe even that can be a way to rescue a biblical text. I think if you're explicit about what you're doing and saying like, we can re-envision, why don't we re-envision this?
Yeah.
But you're going to run into people who are like, no, the Bible actually says beat your kids and that it's actually a good thing. And the problem with that, obviously, is cognitive science completely disagrees and says abusing a child in that way, not only is it harmful to to them personally and it's traumatic and terrible, but it also doesn't work. It doesn't necessarily improve someone's behavior. It might and it might not. It really depends on the kid. So this is where you're saying the Bible does say this, but the Bible's wrong for it.
But yeah, straight up wrong. Don't take your advice about how to discipline your kids from the Bible. And yeah, I found John Piper posted the passage from Proverbs on Twitter and said, spanking is not abuse, it is love.
Yeah,
and that's
he's
and
a
that's
Calvinist,
just
big Calvinist guy, right?
And that's just flatly wrong. It's abuse. It results in far more trauma than it has ever resulted in better behavior. So yeah, don't beat your kids.
Let's talk about another chapter here about rape victims. And one way that people try to invalidate the Bible or point out the real moral and ethical issues with the Bible is to point out where it really flies in the face of contemporary values. I think a lot of people today agree that you shouldn't beat your kids, but there's still a lot of people that do spank. Like that's not terribly uncommon. Now with this one, it seems a lot more clear-cut. The idea is that people say the Bible claims that if a woman is raped, then her rapist is required to marry her. And that's horrible. Yeah. It obviously disregards the rights and the dignity of the woman. And I don't think you're going to find a lot of people that are going to defend that. So talk about this chapter a little bit.
Yeah, so this is looking at some legislation that we have in Deuteronomy 22, and there's some laws about marriage. You get the classic, if a guy goes in and consummates his marriage and for whatever reason is convinced she's not a virgin, then he accuses her.
You can always tell, Dan.
Yeah, well, and that's what the law is. The woman's parents then have to present evidence of her virginity, which has been interpreted to mean the bloody sheets, because if she bleeds, then obviously she was a virgin. These were not physicians. They didn't have a really good working understanding of the female body, or the male body for that matter. Yeah. And one of the laws talks about if there's adultery with a married woman, then that's the death penalty, straight to death. And then you have two different discussions about if a man should find a woman who is betrothed but not yet married and then lies with her in the city, then that means she should have called out, but she didn't. And so obviously
it's kind of her fault, like
she let it happen. Yeah. And so
she was asking for it.
Yeah. And then if it happens in the open field, then she did call out, but nobody was around to save her. And so only death penalty for the man. And then we get this passage that says, if a man finds a woman who is neither married nor betrothed, seizes her and lies with her, then he must pay her father a significantly elevated bride price, marry her, and he cannot divorce her. And so this is the passage that sounds like the victim of rape is required to marry her rapist. Yeah. And it's a little more complex than a simple black and white answer, as with some of the other things, because the authors of this law think they're doing something good. Because what they're doing is suggesting that this woman she's now tainted goods, because back then marriage was the purchasing of a woman's sexual availability and procreative capacities from another man, usually her father. And she had to have that new car smell. Nobody else, you did not want to have had any other men in your workspace. So if she
saw it as a workspace too, by the way. It really was sort of dehumanizing this way.
Yeah, she was his property in that sense, which is why these are property crimes. Mm-hmm. Because she while she is the victim, the first piece of restitution goes to her father.
Correct.
Because she is no longer eligible for proper Israelite marriage, which means he is out one bride price. He has lost that expected income from basically selling his daughter to a husband. And so he is made whole first. And then it thinks it's doing something good by saying, but wait, there's more, because now he has to marry her and he can never divorce her. And the idea here is that her social identity is still kept integral because she gets to be somebody's wife.
Whereas someone else wouldn't marry her, because it's like, this is horrible. I hate saying this, but it's like a you break it, you bought it policy.
Yeah. And so she would otherwise be left adrift in society without a household and a male head of household to whose social identity she can be subordinate and glom onto.
Yeah.
And so the authors imagine that they're actually helping her out by giving her a way to still be able to participate in good Israelite society. And I raise the point in this chapter that, hey, most scholars don't think these laws were ever enforced. There's overlap with the jurisprudence on the ground in ancient Israel, but Exodus, Deuteronomy, Leviticus, whatever we find in Numbers, these are mainly elite propaganda or scribal exercises. And so a good analogy would be the Ten Commandments outside of courtrooms in the U.S. today. No courtroom in the country actually adjudicates based on the laws on display out front. Those
they don't
are
write that in the ruling.
right. And similarly, when we look in Mesopotamian court cases, we never once find them citing a law code that we also have from ancient Mesopotamia. In fact, many of their rulings disagree with the law codes, indicating those are very similar. This is a monumental inscription that is basically your show cards. This is what we want to put on display for everybody. It's not what's actually governing the jurisprudence on the ground. So it probably never happened that way, but whoever wrote Deuteronomy 22 probably imagined that they were doing the girls a favor, and they definitely weren't. And also we have a parallel in Exodus 22 where it does not use the word for seize. And some people think that in Deuteronomy 22, it doesn't say seize in the sense of against her will. It says caress or something like that, which is pure and utter nonsense. The verb there, whenever it has a human as the direct object, is always about seizing against the will of the human. So this is rape. But in Exodus 22, we have a very similar thing where it says if a man seduces a virgin, then he's required to pay an elevated bride price to the father. But the father can take the money and still keep his daughter. So if this ever came up in a courtroom, I think the father would be like, I'll take the money and I won't turn over my daughter to this person. So while that text does kind of indicate that that's what they expected, that text was probably never enforced.
Also, wasn't he supposed to die if he did that? I guess this was only when they thought the woman was somewhat culpable too, or?
No, he wasn't supposed to die because she's unbetrothed, meaning she has not become the exclusive property of a man yet. So the crime is not as severe.
Got it.
Death if she's married. You have to marry her if she's not, because...
So dads have a little bit less prestige in this situation.
Yeah, because it's something that's still off in the future. The possession, the selling has not yet occurred.
Okay.
And so, and here's a point that I also try to make. Rape is a more serious crime if the woman is married. It gets the death penalty. Rape just means you get another wife if she's not married, meaning it's not really that serious a crime. So... Yeah, it's an issue.
I don't think we should base any of our contemporary laws on that.
No, and we don't, because we know better today. For the most part, we have some pretty stupid laws.
And this is one, like, you haven't seen anybody trying to defend this one, right? Like, this is one maybe I would imagine people just kind of try to stay away from.
Yeah, I would hope. But, there are some Christian nationalists these days who are trying to argue that women shouldn't get to vote and women should, they should have no identity apart from their husbands.
The property view, at least, they would kind of...
Yeah. I think they would love to revisit that for sure.
Okay. All right, well, we're talking to Dan McClellan about The Bible Says So, what we get right and wrong about Scripture's most controversial issues, and we'll wrap it up with a discussion about homosexuality in the Bible. What are the main passages that people use in the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament that condemns homosexuality? What are they pointing to say, God says this is wrong?
The main ones are probably Leviticus 18:22 and Leviticus 20, verse 13. These are two passages that list a bunch of sexual crimes. And they say, a male shall not lie with a man as with a woman. This is an abomination. That's Leviticus 18:22. And then Leviticus 20, verse 13 says they'll both be put to death. So it adds a punishment. And these are rather late in the history of the development of the books of Moses. This is a literary layer known as H, or the Holiness Code. This is a post-exilic composition. We don't really have anything prior to that in the legislation that even addresses that kind of issue. And it really seems to be prohibiting a man taking the insertive role, and only the man taking the insertive role, in an act of male same-sex intercourse.
So being penetrated.
Doing the penetrating.
Okay.
Taking the insert, yes.
Oh, the insertive role. Yes.
The insertive role,
Just trying
yes.
to break this down to my to my little brain.
And people will point to Leviticus 20, verse 13, which is probably actually a later version of the law where somebody has slapped a punishment onto it. They'll say, well, that says both of them are put to death, so obviously they're both culpable. Mm-hmm. And that's not a good take, because in Leviticus 20:13, we have several different sexual indiscretions that are punished with a variety of things, mostly death, but other things, and including a prohibition on a man or a woman having intercourse with an animal, where the animal is also put to death. And the reason for this is that in both of these passages, the problem with these sexual crimes is that the land cannot tolerate this. The idea is that there's some kind of metaphysical contamination that is generated by these acts because they are transgressive of the social boundaries and the hierarchies that have been established.
And there's some sort of like fertilization parallel, maybe. They're thinking like if the land can't be fruitful if there's unfruitful things happening on it or something.
That's an interpretation that has been suggested. I don't know that it's particularly. I don't think it's particularly robust because like you never have a prohibition on male masturbation.
Oh, it's not robust.
Even though
I'm not robust, you guys. Damn it.
Even though that would kind of be the same thing.
Yeah.
As male same-sex intercourse.
Well, the reason I thought of it is because there's that passage where they're like putting different colors in front of the animals, and then they would like bear that color of an animal, right?
Yeah.
So I was thinking it was kind of that sort of transactional view of, you know.
Yeah, there is an idea that it's wasteful of the semen, but I don't think that makes sense of the text as a whole.
So
But
it's just a straight up metaphysical belief of like, this does something bad for the land.
Yeah, this contamination gets out on the land, it pollutes it, and the land can only tolerate so much of that pollutant before it must vomit them out. And so both chapters are saying, if you do these things, the land will vomit you out like it did the inhabitants that preceded you.
Yeah, so they came in and took Israel, and they would become like the people that they displaced.
Yeah, and so it's not about the agency or the consent of the receptive partner in any of these laws. It is about the notion that the contamination has to be purged, which requires the deaths of both parties involved, even if one of those parties is an animal.
See, but this doesn't speak to something like pegging or like masturbation or something, right? Am I wrong?
No, it says nothing about that. And and certainly those were things that were going on.
Yeah, people have always had fun with each other from time immemorial, so...
And I think a lot of this is developing because with the exile, you have this increased concern for maintaining ethnic boundaries and insularity and protecting the ethnic identity. And this is why you have, the folks who married foreign women in Ezra and Nehemiah. They've got to divorce them. They've got to send their kids away. We've got to protect the ethnic purity of this people because they're under attack. They are under threat of destruction. And so this is a defensive way of doing this, and sex and marriage become one of the ways that they maintain the kind of purity that allows them to survive. Mm-hmm. And so I think this is something that is a post-exilic rationale.
Okay.
You don't find this in the pre-exilic period.
But it's still saying don't do it. So how do you take the teeth out of that for someone who's like, hey, we might not believe the whole metaphysical, like hurting the land thing, or we might... like, but it's there, so we got to obey it.
Well, we got to obey what it says in Leviticus is not something that you hear from a lot of thoughtful Christians. Now, when you can look in some of the best commentaries on Leviticus, the Anchor Yale Bible Commentary Series, for instance, and they'll point out, hey, this is about the land of Israel and the house of Israel. Even if you do think the law of Moses remains in effect, you are exempt if you are not either living in the land of Israel or a member of the house of Israel.
Yeah.
And so, like, even if this is supposed to be in effect, it doesn't apply to most of the people who are appealing to this piece of legislation.
I wondered why you didn't make the point that, like, the law code says all sorts of other stuff, too. Like, it says, like, not to mix, don't put, like, milk with meat, or, like, don't wear these certain fabrics together, or else it's an abomination. And you didn't make that point of, like, hey, why are we just zooming in on this abomination when there's all sorts of abominations, according to the Bible, that we all do? Yeah,
there certainly are, and a lot of them have to do with the food that you're eating, which is something that Christians ignore. But and the reason I didn't, it would have taken some space to cover that, and I wanted to, but I was running out of word count. And it was mainly because most Christians already have a ready answer to that. Oh, well, you know, they don't say it like this, but we've renegotiated the significance of the law of Moses. If they want to appeal to Leviticus, that, you know, if Jesus repeated something, then it's still relevant, or they'll go to Paul and say, well, Paul says it, or, you know, the Jerusalem Council says abstain from sexual immorality.
Yeah, they don't need Leviticus. Okay.
They don't need Leviticus, but it is still the most explicit thing, which is why that's usually the first stop where Christians will go, Leviticus.
I'm surprised it's not Sodom and Gomorrah, though, because that story seems more pointed, and I'll let you debunk it real quick, but the idea is basically that these angels come down to this city, they go into this dude's house, and then the ruffian freaks of the city show up and bang on the door and say, let him out, we're gonna sexually assault this dude. And then the guy's like, oh, no, don't do that. Here's my daughter. Which is also, they don't really point to that part of it when they're talking about it. They just say, see, look, there's all these like gay guys in this city that are trying to sexually assault this dude, and then God destroys the whole land. And that's why sodomy, you know, comes from the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. So that seems pretty straightforward, doesn't it?
Not if you're paying close attention to the story. It is deeply problematic in a lot of ways, and particularly the way Lot is like, take my virgin daughters instead, which is a way to literarily show that Lot was meeting the expectations regarding how you treat guests. Particularly foreigners. You're supposed to extend, you know, your house to them and treat them as if they are part of your family. And so this is kind of a hyperbolic demonstration of Lot's commitment to the expectations of hospitality. And so it's in contrast.
Especially for strangers.
Yes, especially for strangers, but it is
meaning foreigners. You could say aliens. You could
or immigrants or refugees or asylum seekers. There are lots of different ways you could refer to the folks you are supposed to treat even better than your own family.
We forgot about that part. Go on.
That maybe from now on, when people say, "Well, you will treat your family better than the immigrant," maybe they need Genesis 19 thrown at them.
Exactly.
Actually, if you're righteous. But that hospitality is supposed to be contrasted against the inhospitality of the men of Sodom, and their main crime is using the threat of sexually assaulting other men in an effort to demean, to emasculate, to assert dominance over them, which is something that still goes on in many different parts of the world.
Warfare,
in warfare, in prisons, in some kind of village justice. You know, criminals, they will engage in male rape in order to put them in their place. It's not about sexual attraction. It's about violence and it's about power. And so that's their crime, and that is like the most rank manifestation of inhospitality the author can think of.
Yeah.
And there's a parallel story in Judges 19 where the exact same thing happens with a Levite and his concubine. And people will say, well, you know, Lot said, take my daughters, please. And they said no, so they're obviously gay.
They're gay, dude. Yeah.
Right. They're not attracted to women.
No, that wasn't the point. The point wasn't to have sex with anybody. The point was to assault the strangers as a show of force. What's interesting you point out is like the Bible itself gives us this interpretation. Is it in Ezekiel where it points out that...
It's in Ezekiel 16:49 where Ezekiel says, the sin of Sodom was this.
Yeah, and it wasn't being gay.
She was prideful. had an overabundance of bread, prosperous ease, yet she did not strengthen the hand of the poor and the needy. She was haughty and did abominations.
She wasn't a haughty, she was haughty.
Right. She was haughty, not shoddy, not hot. But that was awful. But then the people will respond, he said abominations, and we're gonna smuggle in homosexuality.
That means gay. Yeah.
Even though, sexually assaulting men was even more of an abomination in their eyes. In fact, you could very easily interpret Leviticus 18:22 and Leviticus 20:13. In fact, I think there's a good case to make that it was the intended interpretation as a prohibition precisely on sexually assaulting other men. This may be why the prohibition is on the one taking the insertive role,
right,
even though the victim is put to death as well. But we've already seen the laws of the Hebrew Bible are not overly concerned with the well-being of the victims of sexual assault.
Right.
So it's just an awful argument that Genesis 19 is a lesson on the evils of a homosexual orientation. They didn't even have a concept of sexual orientation that in any way approximates how we understand the concept today.
Yeah, but as you point out, Christians don't need that. They've got the New Testament. So where are they going in the New Testament? How do you handle New Testament verses that seem to condemn what we today call homosexuality?
So you've got, probably the main one is Romans 1, verses 26 and 27, but you've also got 1 Corinthians 6:9, and a passage in Timothy.
Wait, 6:9?
Yes.
Nice.
Don't go there. But Romans 1 is making the case that the Gentiles, the Greeks, are depraved, and because they are violators of God's law, they are worthy of death. But rhetorically, that's setting up Paul's listeners to be like, aha, we're better. And then he turns the tables on them and goes, no, you're also violators of the law, worthy of the same. And so in order to paint the Greeks as worthy of death, he's kind of doing a vice list and talking about all the things that they're doing wrong. And he describes how they worship the created rather than the creator. And he's presupposing a kind of natural theology where you can arrive at an adequate understanding of God and how God expects to be worshiped by observing the natural world. And the Greeks are keen observers of the natural world, so they should know better. And Paul says,
there's a divine person who constructed all this. I thought he was saying literally like idols that they'd created with their hands.
Well, he is that's what he's saying they worshipped. But they're doing that because they have failed to acknowledge the true God and how God wants to be worshipped, which is why he says they are without excuse. They should know better because they should have arrived at the correct conclusion by observing nature.
Because the witness of nature would say, of course there's a God. Look at the stars and sun and la la la. Yeah. Okay.
Consider the lilies of the GD field. To quote the great poet.
Yes.
And then he goes on to say that as a result of this, God has turned them over to these unclean desires. And the idea here seems to be that human sexuality has kind of a natural governor or ceiling to it, but because they're not properly worshiping God, God is like, fine, I'm taking off the governor. I'm removing the limits on human sexuality, and it's just going to go everywhere. And this
dogs and cats living together.
Yeah, mass hysteria. And this then results in women having sex with other women, men having sex with other men, which means that for Paul, same-sex intercourse is the outcome of God's punishment that only happens if a people is not adequately worshiping God, which would mean it should not happen among the faithful. We know that's not true. We know that a homosexual orientation is a random thing that, has a degree of randomness to it. That means it is not isolated only to the people who are not appropriately worshiping God. And so while I think Paul was not a fan of same-sex intercourse and explicitly condemns both male and female same-sex intercourse, by the way, female same-sex intercourse totally ignored in the Hebrew Bible, nowhere brought up. And if we go to 1 Corinthians 6:9, we have a word malachi, which means soft ones, which probably refers to people who seek out the receptive role in an act of male same-sex intercourse.
Wussies.
And then arsenokite, which would be the men who seek out the insertive role in an act of male same-sex intercourse. And the thing I would say about this, I think we can acknowledge that Paul was not a fan of homosexuality, or at least same-sex intercourse.
Yeah.
Without saying that ought to have anything at all to do with how we live our lives today, because Paul also is not a fan of sex in general and says we should all be celibate.
And like he was, he says.
Yeah, like he was. And then it goes on to say, in order to prevent sexual immorality, if you can't hack celibacy, it's better to marry than to burn. And the idea there is burn with sexual desire.
Get super horny.
Yeah. And so Paul makes accommodations for sexual desire.
You have to say super horny.
Yes. For the super horny, Paul makes accommodations. Yes. The idea is just, have occasional prophylactic passionless sex. In 1 Thessalonians 4, he says
he thought the world was ending too, right? Wasn't this a big part of it? It's like, Jesus is coming back ASAP, so we don't need to get into all this.
He does not say a word about procreation. Like, for Paul, sex is not about procreation because we ain't got time for that because Jesus is coming back. And so it's just for that passionless sex. He even says in 1 Thessalonians, when you possess your vessel in honor and virtue. And this is a reference to having sex, and where the vessel is probably the wife. Virtue and honor, not with the passion of desire, like the dirty, dirty Gentiles who don't know God. And so even when you are having sex, it should not be because of passionate desire. And you have other Greco-Roman period Jewish literature that has a bunch of different takes on how disciplined you should be about sex. For some, it is only for the express purpose of procreation, and even when you're doing it for that reason, you're not allowed to like it. Yeah. And then others will say, well, you can enjoy it, but still only for the express purpose of procreation. Some people say once you hit menopause, it's game over. Other people are a little more
reproduce.
Right. And others are a little more, a little more tolerant of that. So you have a bunch of different perspectives, but Paul seems to be taking a pretty strict stance on this. And
it's clear Christians today aren't following Paul's overall sexual ethic. They're cherry picking these particular things about homosexuality.
And reject the rest of his sexual ethic precisely because we don't like it anymore. And so that's a problem.
And it takes me right to what I see as a big crux of the book and your project, and it's this. Have you experienced changing people's minds? Have you seen instances where sitting down and reasoning through this stuff has altered someone's views?
It is phenomenally rare, and usually it's for folks who are not quite as dogmatically committed. I have received, I think within the last few months, maybe 2 messages where people have either messaged me or commented on something apologizing for having criticized me, a year, 2 years, 3 years ago, and saying I'm now under, in the process of deconstructing or something like that. It's quite rare, but I think while I love for that to happen with my work, I don't think that's the main rhetorical goal of my work. I think that's a side effect. I think the main rhetorical goal of my work is to speak to those people who are already seeking, who are already wondering what's going on with these things, and maybe they're looking for permission to take this seriously, to ask these questions. Maybe they're looking for resources so that they can explore these questions. Maybe they're looking for guidance, or they want to know why. And I get responses from people every day who say that I have helped them heal from past trauma, or heal relationships with family members or with friends, either folks who are who they have rejected because they are taking the Bible too seriously, or other folks that they reject for themselves taking the Bible too seriously. I never could have anticipated the kinds of responses that I have gotten from folks who have found a lot of different applications for my work, and those are the folks that I'm doing this for primarily. There is a degree to which I am trying to convince some other people, which is why I'm trying to come up with increasingly accessible arguments. But at the end of the day, I'm going to, if I have to pick between somebody who's not going to be convinced and someone who is already looking, I'm hoping that my work reaches the person who's already looking, so that they can find the resources, so that they can find the guidance, so that they can find the permission, the authorization to ask these questions and to explore these approaches to the Bible.
That's Dan McClellan talking about the book, The Bible Says So, What We Get Right and Wrong About Scripture's Most Controversial Issues. Dan, I always like to close with regrets, challenges, and surprises. And this is a moment for you to reflect on your project, this project in particular. Anytime a book goes out there, there's probably something you wish you could change. So are there any regrets at this point? I know, it's recent, so maybe you haven't had a lot of time to stew on that. And maybe you're not a person who does stew on that. Or what was the hardest part about writing it? Or was there something new you learned? I think in this one, it seemed like a lot of these you'd already covered on social media, maybe all of them. So I don't know if there's a lot of surprises, but you can choose what to speak to.
I think it was, this was kind of a greatest hits thing. So while I refined some things along the way, I think my biggest regret was that I did not have the word count to be able to include a chapter on whether or not the Bible says women cannot have authority in the church. That was definitely chapter number 1 of volume 2. I came up with a list of a number of things that I wanted to include in a volume 2, but number 1 on the list is that chapter about whether or not women are allowed to have authority.
Well, so that's a regret, but that's one you can rectify. And you have done some on that too, right? You've done some social media stuff on the topic. So
couple of times, yeah.
Any hardest part about it, was it that basically trying to decide what to fit in with the word count limitations?
The other hardest part was trying to learn to write in a different language, because I have for years been writing in a scholarly language, and it is a different language from how I speak into a camera. And my agent and my publisher were both trying to coach me, because they were like, you still are writing as if you're trying to convince your colleagues, and that's not what a trade book is. And so it took a long time, and I'm not perfect yet. I still have a long way to go to be able to write in a way that is closer to the way people are used to hearing me speak. So I would say that's the biggest challenge that I faced.
Yeah. I thought you did a good job. I really like the pop culture references. You'll often have some references to, again, we kind of grew up at the same time, so you're like talking, there's some Pearl Jam stuff and some other
got to do that
throughout. Well, Dan, thanks for talking to me about the book today. The Bible Says So. Highly recommend it. It's well written. I think your voice comes through. I think you did a great job in terms of communicating it well.
Thank you.
I enjoy following you on social media, and just keep up the good work.
Thanks, Blair. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Relationscapes. And if you enjoyed this one, I'll recommend a fellow traveler episode. Check out Sarah Glass's interview. The episode is called When High-Demand Religions Control Sexuality. And I also recommend rating and reviewing Relationscapes in Apple Podcasts. It's really easy to do. It's free. It doesn't cost you a thing. And it helps me let guests and new listeners know what the show is all about. So go to Apple Podcasts, open up the app, search Relationscapes, scroll down, you'll see ratings and reviews. Tap that, you're ready to go. You can also more easily rate the show in Spotify if that's where you listen. Mates of State provides our theme song. I'm your host, Blair Hodges, a journalist here in Salt Lake City, and I'll see you next time.
They came in, they told me one day, they said, you will not believe what they are going to do to North Nashville.
I remember white men coming and pounding a red and white stake where I live, and measurements were taken.
All the houses, they were all torn down.
They were all gone. It changed everything.
A highway ripped through the heart of this historically black neighborhood, but the community's elders stood their ground.
There are some of us, we stayed in the hood.
Because this is home. The North Nashville before the interstate, before urban renewal, integration, gentrification, this North Nashville lives in these elders.
This is their story.
I'm Andrea Tedhope.
And I'm Simone Boyd.
And we're the hosts of the podcast We Are North Nashville.
Listen wherever you get your podcasts.